Good afternoon, and welcome to Speaking of Streets, rethinking the relationship between the built environment and the personal automobile. My name is Rod Arroyo. I'm a partner at Giffels Webster. Also on our panel this afternoon, we have Jill Boehm, a partner at Giffels Webster, and Eric Fazzini, senior planner at Giffels Webster. So the session is going to focus on the relationship between the built environment and the personal automobile in various settings. Key topics we're going to cover today include how has planning for the built environment changed over the past century, how are downtowns rethinking the use of public spaces, and how can suburban communities deal with cars that people still need because transportation options are limited. Planning for the automobile has really changed everything. This aerial photo from the Metro Detroit area shows our pattern of single-use districts, the disruption of the neighborhood grid, and massive land area devoted to highway infrastructure. McMansions, big boxes, strip malls, cars, cars, cars. So much of our land is now dedicated to the temporary storage of cars, otherwise known as parking. All of these cars create demand for parking and regulations to require parking. As far back as the landmark US Supreme Court case of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, it clearly supported parking requirements, noting that parking requirements would end up limiting congestion on streets by reducing the amount of drivers that would be circling blocks searching for on-street parking. There was a time when many users shared the street space. This photo is from 1920 in downtown Los Angeles. Traffic speeds were naturally low. No high-speed crashes occurred here, but ultimately the cars won. So about 4 years after that LA photo was taken, auto companies began to villainize the pedestrian in order to clear the roadbed for cars. They were able to turn our media outlets to blame pedestrians. The term J means a bumpkin or a hick, so car dealers actually recruited Boy Scouts to distribute handbills describing the evil of jaywalking, all to clear the streets for the road. Our professional society has been a big supporter of single-use shopping areas with lots of parking. 1959 Planning Advisory Service report provided a wide range of parking requirements for both existing and proposed shopping centers. And here are a few gems from that report. One, we know of no existing center that has too much parking. Shopping centers will be a phenomena of growing importance in the automobile age and perhaps the helicopter age if that is to come. Shopping centers represent an upgrading over many existing commercial neighborhoods, and there will be no apartments over the stores in modern shopping centers. So you might say we planned for this vision and we now own it. The cost of parking is very high. In this example, a 4,800 square foot retail use requires 24 spaces at $6,000 per space roughly. This adds $144,000 to a project. It also removes valuable land from a more productive use. And as Donald Shoup pointed out in A High Cost of Free Parking, ample free parking also serves to induce additional travel. For example, if parking is limited or very expensive, you might think about walking, riding, biking, riding a bike, or maybe seeking some other form of transit. But if parking is free, you're more likely to drive your car. Hence, we then have to pay for additional road infrastructure to handle that additional traffic. This was the first fully enclosed shopping center in the United States, Northland Mall in Southfield. We see lots of ample parking. The people are inside. The traffic congestion is really pushed out to the streets and almost no one walked there. This mall no longer exists. This photo really demonstrates the power of auto-oriented development and single-purpose zoning districts. Two cul-de-sacs, very little connection between them. Because physical connectivity is lacking, it also breaks down social connectivity, and it also therefore impacts public health, road efficiency, public services, and the environment. The automobile and the failures of sprawl are increasing demand by all adults, young and old, for more walkable communities. New car sales are trending down. Also, we're seeing significant support in our community surveys for more bike and walking infrastructure. With the pandemic, ride sharing is down, food prep meal sales are up, food and product home deliveries are up, and working from home will likely continue at some level. I think this statistic is rather startling and can be a very good thing for us. With COVID-19, vehicle miles traveled in the US have now dropped to 1995 levels. This creates an opportunity for us to direct funding to other transportation modes, encourage working from home policies to continue, and much more. We really can use this as an opportunity to rethink our streets. And that's our next segment. Jill Boehm's going to take over now and talk about a project that we worked in Brighton.
Always do that. Thanks, Rod. So as Rod was saying, trends in the marketplace and in consumer and public attitudes are really suggesting that a shift is occurring. And people are starting to recognize that our reliance on cars is really limiting how much our built environment can adapt to the ways in which we want to live today. So the next few minutes of our conversation is going to highlight a project that we worked on with the City of Brighton. It's their first implementation project from their comprehensive plan. So here in this slide, I wanted to share with you that we did a story map. So there's a web-based platform that describes this project in more detail than we can get into today. There's a link there at the bottom, and I believe that the slides from this are up with maps, so you'll be able to look at this later if you want to dive a little bit more deeply. But we wanted to share with you how the city used an integrated approach that combined planning and engineering and landscape architecture and surveying to really rethink how their downtown streets and sidewalks could better promote the kind of vibrancy and connectivity and promote their downtown the way that their community was seeking. So the city is generally laid out on a grid pattern, so it was really developed that way to make it a very traditional downtown. In the foreground here is Grand River Avenue. That's an MDOT road, and I don't need to get into the ways in which that is not a pedestrian friendly environment, as I'm sure you can appreciate. But going off into the distance there is Main Street. On Main Street, the existing conditions are 13 to 14 foot lanes. With one section that's about an 18-foot wide lane. So very much adapted to the automobile over time. So we noticed there that Brighton had a very tired streetscape, that it had very limited areas on its sidewalks. Oh, Brad, you want to go to the next slide for me? Thank you. So a lot of the downtown has narrow sidewalks. There's very little room for pedestrian activity, including outdoor dining, which you'll see on the next slide. This is something that's desirable in every downtown, and even more so now during the pandemic. They recognize that with the existing structures that they had in the sidewalks and in the space that they had allocated on those sidewalks, that they really just didn't have enough room. So the downtown plan that we helped the city create was actually part of a comprehensive plan that included the master plan, also a recreation plan and a complete streets plan. And these plans are all woven together in a way that support each other. But the downtown plan really focuses on strategies to strengthen downtown, not only as a place to shop and to dine, but as a place to live and engage with each other in the community. So in the downtown plan, we have graphics and illustrations that support that those public spaces. So the implementation of the downtown plan really represents an opportunity for the city to proactively shape the character and the feel of downtown through rethinking the dimensions of the streets and sidewalks, as well as adding new street furniture, art, landscaping, and lighting. So our team was comprised of planners, engineers, surveyors, and landscape architects. And using this integrated approach, we were able to help the city understand their existing infrastructure, to facilitate public engagement, to assess the needs for pedestrians and vehicles, and create a conceptual streetscape plan that supports the goals and objectives of the downtown plan. In addition, we had Bob Gibbs on our team as well, and he helped with the shoppability considerations of the streetscape plan. So really ensuring that that public realm space did serve the businesses that were down on Main Street. This is a really cool additional tool that we were able to employ. This is our Leica P40 terrestrial scanner. And it allowed our design team to collect more data than we would have normally been able to collect with a traditional survey. And we were able to do this with a minimal impact to our budget. We did it over the course of 5 nights to minimize the pedestrian and vehicular traffic that would normally be downtown. But the cool thing is on the next slide, you'll see that the point clouds that the scanner produced were translated into a 2D survey. And it shows all of the dimensions of the streets and sidewalks and the location of underground utilities. Additionally, we were able to collect facade features, building facade features that in a dimensioned capacity where we're able to conduct a synoptic survey. And this we took into a separate part of the project to develop a form-based code for downtown. So that was another nice way that we could use some of our technologies in multiple fashions. So through an online visual preference survey, 2 stakeholder open houses and several meetings with the DDA, the design team, our team learned about how the downtown is used every day and how it's used seasonally, as well as the general aesthetic preferred for downtown elements. And our resulting streetscape design narrows the street width. So we got the streets down from 13 to 14 feet down to 11 to 12 feet, which was great because now we have more opportunities to utilize that public space for people and not necessarily for cars. The best part is that we were also able to maintain the on-street parking. This was important to the community. We recognize that people do come, we want people to come to downtown from other places. And at this point in time, we really have to recognize that we can only do that in a car. The segment 2, this is sort of like the heart of the downtown area. You can see in the image, you could see a little bit of it, the Mill Pond, which is an area that's heavily used and all around that area. And we featured a curbless plaza here, which provides some flexible space to accommodate all of the events and festivals that are held downtown. So we're able to widen the sidewalks to 16 to 20 feet, maintain the on-street parking, and still provide some really great flexible space for those activities. And then the third segment does go east of Grand River, where again, we're able to increase the sidewalks and providing some special pavement treatment to the intersection really will call people's attention to the fact that this is where downtown is, and this is a highlight. And that helps both pedestrians and people driving. Again, just a couple of images of the curbless streets. So if we remove the curbs on Main Street near the Mill Pond, we're able to offer some flexibility for the downtown events and festivals, but still maintain the on-street parking. And we define the pedestrian areas with pavement treatment, landscaping, and protective bollards. So the next steps, the city is continuing to move forward with this, identifying funding sources, preparing their detailed construction drawings, planning out a timeline, and then importantly, developing a strategy to support the businesses during construction. So those will all be part and parcel of the streetscape effort, and really helping people recognize the value of rethinking those streets and those public spaces and shifting away from the personal vehicle and putting more focus on people. And in another community, we are going to be sharing, this is a very different kind of community. This is a community without a downtown per se at all. It's a very suburban community. If you want to go to the next slide there, Rod. We know that in the suburbs, we still are finding that people want to have more walkability, and we're looking to develop more compact building forms. We know that some communities are eliminating and reducing parking requirements. We have several of our communities that are trying to pursue that. But other communities in the suburbs primarily are concerned that they're at risk of being underparked. In Rochester Hills, they're a thriving suburban community. We helped them with their 2018 master plan, and the community really recognized as we went through this process that the things that made them successful in a desirable community, subdivision housing, employment centers, abundant commercial uses, also present a lot of challenges in terms of affordability, traffic, and a loss of open space. So the plan's vision is to, and I won't read all of these, but essentially we're trying to enhance walkability, improve it, anticipate changing modes of transportation, and land use recommendations that really limit impacts to the existing transportation network. part of the way that we do that is focusing on areas that have specific redevelopment potential. So this allows the city to have certain focused areas that increase density without compromising the character of other parts of the community that have more of the open space. We're concentrating denser housing forms in these areas that have proximity to shopping and employment centers so that we can begin to encourage alternative transportation, such as walking or biking to work. So the city has a really strong interest in advance in seeing a more walkable community, but that presents them with some challenges, as Eric is going to share with you.
So continuing the denser housing form discussion and focusing more on the Planning Commission and zoning side, the Rochester Hills Planning Commission had concerns with some recent developments they had seen for multiple family. As developable land in cities naturally decreases over time as they're built out, developers become more creative, as you know, and development becomes more dense and more urban. So the balance was, how do we consider multiple family development and balance these concerns with providing adequate parking? So these are two of the projects that the Planning Commission had considered. One on the left is unbuilt, it's in progress, and the one on the right is built. These are both, in my opinion, high quality developments. I'm sure many cities would be happy to have, and want to point out on the bottom two images that the parking style with these two developments is primarily in garages and on driveways. So the focus of the Planning Commission's concern was related to a development that was actually outside of the city that they were familiar with, and they were concerned with the lack of visitor parking provided at that development, and then how that related to developments that they were considering. So their initial reaction was to look at increasing the multiple family parking requirement to 2 spaces per unit. So with that direction, we tested that hypothetical ratio on several existing developments, focusing on visitor parking. And what we found was that a perceived or actual lack of visitor parking was the result of 2 things. And this is an image of that development that was outside of the city. First is how developers count proposed parking spaces. And then second, that in reality, garage and driveway spaces for this style of development are effectively owned by the corresponding units. So with this development, the units are 3-story stacks. So each vertical row you see there is 1 unit. So how developers count proposed parking. So the development in the previous image provided double the amount of parking that's required. So they have 187 spaces, primarily 4 per unit. So 2 in the garage and 2 on the driveway. So the question is, how could there be a shortfall for visitor parking if a development's providing double the amount of parking required? So what we found was that 172 of the 187 spaces provided were effectively owned by these units. In other words, a visitor to unit 1 is not going to park in the garage or driveway to visit someone at unit 5. So the issue we found was with tandem parking, that it creates inflated proposed parking number for this style of development, since these spaces are tied to individual units, garages and driveways. So the solution we pursued was to break up these owned garage and driveway spaces from visitor spaces. Only increasing the requirement to 2 spaces per unit wouldn't have solved this visitor specific parking issue, and could have actually resulted in excessive parking being required. So at the top right is essentially our recommendation was to prohibit the garage and driveway spaces from being counted towards visitor spaces. So then on the left is the language that we provided that's tied to the visitor parking ratio. So what that means then is more parking is not necessarily required, but it can be provided on street. This is an image of that same development of the frontage street, and it could also be dispersed throughout the site. So 2 things related to streets and parking are that it's important to be mindful of on-street parking, to allow it if you can, and to make sure that developers don't voluntarily prohibit it to get through the entitlement process, such as using no parking fire lane signs, or to squeeze it in wherever there's room. And then also for the dispersed parking, to make sure that it's a reasonable distance to the unit. So shopping centers generally are 300 feet from your car to your door. So maybe smaller parking areas throughout a development rather than one large parking lot or an offsite shared parking lot that may not be as usable.
So that concludes the presentation that we wanted to give, and we wanted to make sure we left a little time for Q&A. So I'm going to stop the screen share there, and I think
Thank
Amy,
you. Yep, I'm here to. I have. Well, we've got almost 50 people on the call, so I would love to see some more questions. The first question is from Jacob, and he asks, why do you use the term curbless streets over, and I want to make sure I say this right, Wooner?
Love this question. Probably because we'd have to explain it every single time we used it, and then we'd have to tell people how to pronounce it. Curbless streets just is something that kind of people can get that more easily, and we're trying to make things, I think, more accessible to people. Rod, do you
well,
have any
and the Woonerf in its pure term has got pedestrians and vehicles and all forms of transportation all kind of intermingling at once in the street. And that this is really not as that pure in terms of the way it might function, where more in fact you could think of that first photo we showed from Los Angeles where everybody's all intermingled in the street together. That is more the way that I think the traditional Woonerf would be seen, is you just have to, whoever's there first gets the right of way. The road's generally going to still function like a downtown street. With the curbless element. It's just that when the city closes the street and they want to open it up to the festivals, that curbless section then becomes more of a plaza area that's much more adaptable to event space. And it just gives a lot more flexibility going forward. So I think that's probably the best way that we could describe the difference.
Thank you for that. And I have, I'm asking that you place the questions in the Q&A box. We have about 7 more minutes for conversation. The next question I have is from Brad Strader. And Brad says he has a suggestion on, let's see, he would like a suggestion on how much visitor parking per unit is the sweet spot. And he'd also like to know, is there a general standard for it to be dispersed?
So it varies depending on community. What we found generally is 0.3 per unit is an adequate visitor ratio. For Rochester Hills, that we actually increased that to 0.5 per unit based on the Planning Commission's desire. And what was the second part?
Do you have a general standard for it to be dispersed?
No. So what I kind of try to reiterate, so the 300-foot maximum is generally something that you could have in your shared parking standards, that off-site parking or something related to off-site parking or shared parking. But what we were trying to emphasize was maybe to have pockets of smaller parking areas, having them balanced throughout the site so that there's maybe a certain ratio or a certain number tied to areas of a development rather than having one large parking area. And there's really, that 300-foot is a maximum for shopping centers that I've seen. So that could be used as a guide. But just something I think to be more mindful of during the site plan review process, to try to, picture yourself as a resident of the development thinking, if I have visitors, where are they going to park? Is this too far away to park? Is that being accommodated for my guests?
And I think the real hope too is that we're going to encourage more on-street parking within multiple family developments. Traditionally, the suburban multiple family development didn't really had the substandard access drives coming in with no real room for on-street parking. And if we design them more like the examples that Eric had with the townhouse, where you actually have a street coming in, as long as the street is at least 27 feet wide, you can have parking on one side of the road and still meet fire code regulations for clearance, which is what, as we know, we're always struggling with, trying to find that balance between the requirements of the fire department and what planners are trying to accomplish. But with 27 feet, as long as you have that width, you can have parking on one side of the roadway. So that might be something to think about in your standards for multiple family if you're trying to encourage that.
And there might also be distance standards, separation standards between driveways that would accommodate vehicles. A lot of times we see driveway with just a little bit of space in between. It's really not enough space for a car to park between those two driveways. And I think also getting people used to the fact that people are going to park in front of your house.
Thank you. Jonathan Palin has a question, and he would like to know, how do you overcome the challenges of a community's goals related to streets when the streets are under another jurisdiction, such as the state or county?
Well, I think that if you're talking about internal streets, which I'm assuming is what the question is related to, streets within a development, then typically, if you follow most county requirements, you're generally going to be able to get one side of the street with on-street parking. Generally, what you do is the side of the street that has water, assuming you have public water and there are fire hydrants, that would be the side you wouldn't have the on-street parking. You would put the on-street parking on the opposite side. That would certainly be the goal. If you're not able to do that, working with your own county road agency, then it could initially start with a good conversation and describe what the community's goals are and see what can be done to open up the conversation to get them to hopefully move to the point where they'll allow for the types of parking and the other types of changes within the right-of-way that the community is looking to see happen.
I think too, to kind of reaffirm that, the last part of what you were saying, Rod, about involving the road jurisdictions or the road agencies, involve them early in the planning process. We've learned that in a couple of our different communities, one in which we came later after the community had done a significant portion of planning, and then we tried to involve the road agency. They had other plans by that point. Working with them early, engaging them early so that they could be part of the conversation really makes a difference, and engage them as partners in your community as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I know that with our work with the Transportation Bonanza, that they always, the MDOT always talks about that opportunity curve and making sure that the communities are getting in there at the right time. So thank you for that. I have one more question. With the shared or curbless streets, do you see a wide variety of materials for the surface to be more friendly to pedestrians? And are there challenges that result because of the dual use?
I think the materials question would be similar to what you would see for crosswalks. So we're using that as a dual function as well. We're driving across it, we're walking across it. That would be something that's similar that you would have in the curbless streets areas. Sometimes it's just concrete. Sometimes there are additional techniques. We're not huge fans of the pavers. So preferring the concrete, which is always a good material. It can be treated differently so that it stands out from the other parts of the sidewalk. But I think those are generally things that we're testing.
Right, and there's some communities that have used integrally colored concrete so that it has downtown Northville is a great example where it's actually has dyed a gray color to match what they do in Paris. Basically, that was the influence for that. So there's different things you could do to give those visual cues that the pavement's changing in terms of functionality as well.
And I did have one last comment that came in. Mr. Krent would like to know, is a half a parking space for each unit? It seems kind of limiting. What happens when there's a family birthday party or holiday gatherings?
So just to go back to that, the other question that's kind of related. So we had one of our traffic engineers look at Metro Detroit, and generally they found that 0.3 was an acceptable number, working towards a 1.7 for units with combined visitor and resident parking. Typically parking is never 100% occupied, so there's always a shared trade-off. That's why on-street parking is so important, because it's kind of a hidden parking area, not being formal, so it can accommodate much more parking than just a parking lot in a parking space. because of the parallel, efficiencies that you get on the curb. But yeah, that was something that Planning Commission kept going back to was events, big family gatherings, things like that. So the way we looked at it was to treat multiple family uses equally as single family. So, single family areas have events and parties too. So to not, pick on multiple family developments from that standpoint, require excessive parking for something that may occur, throughout a city.
Yeah, and for example, just as a parallel, not discriminating against multiple family, single family, you may find that someone's having a graduation party and then down the block, another person's having one the same day, and you end up walking a long way maybe to get to that location. And that could happen in a multiple family development too, where someone's having an event and turns out there's another person in the unit next door that's doing the same thing. So we learn to adapt. We certainly don't build parking to fit the absolute maximum demand day of the year.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. This has been a wonderful session. I appreciate you all tuning in today. Before we go, we do have Michigan Association of Planning added a afterglow tomorrow from 2 to 3, and you can join us with the Zoom link on the platform. And then before we leave, I also would like to know if any of the Giffels Webster experts have any closing remarks.
Just if you go into the lounge area, you'll find we've got a couple of PDF files there, one of which dives a little deeper into the Brighton project. So if you want to learn more, you can find that there. And then if you're interested, once again, in the diving into it in even more detail, as Jill mentioned, there's the story map and the link will be available for that as well. So feel free to look at that. There's a lot of good information there. And we appreciate the opportunity.
We do. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. We're excited that we were able to offer a half a credit of AICP, so that was cool. If you want to have more conversation, feel free to just send us an email, give us a call. We'd love to chat.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.